Alright guys, today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I am going to talk about my hopes and fears for Amazon Prime's The Rings of Power. Maya Gavan and Mellyn, and welcome to Tolkien Untangled's first Top 10 Lists video. So, in the past few weeks, we have gone from knowing next to nothing about this show to getting a name, various promo images, a Vanity Fair article, and finally our first look at a trailer. And I have some thoughts. So, just for now, I'll take a bit of a break from Tolkien's First Age lore and his other writings to focus on what's coming in the future. Because, although Amazon got the ball rolling on this project way back in 2017, I think 5 years ago, the wait is now finally almost over. On September the 2nd, which incidentally is the anniversary of the day that Tolkien died on, hopefully that's not an ill omen, we will return to Middle-earth in the first live-action, high-budget adaptation since the Hobbit movies. And you guys don't need me to tell you that this show has its fair share of controversies attached to it. If you've not been living under a rock, you will know that a lot of people are not enthusiastically stoked about everything that Amazon is doing. And to be honest, I too do have a good deal of reservations and concerns, but I'll talk about them in a few days in another video. In this video, I'm going to be optimistic and positive, and I will put on my rose-tinted glasses to talk about my top 10 hopes for this series. And then, in the next video, I'll get all cynical and grouchy about my fears and apprehensions. But today, right now, we are keeping it positive. So, without any further ado, let's begin my top 10 hopes for Amazon Prime's The Rings of Power. Number 10. The Second Age. So all of Tolkien's ages are awe-inspiring in their own right, and honestly they all have the potential to be wonderfully adapted, but I think a lot of fans would agree that there's something very special about the Second Age. It is the bridge between the highly mythological writings of Tolkien's First Age, the Eldar days, and the much more familiar Third Age, where we see the histories of Gondor, and the Dunedain and Arnor, and the founding of the Shire, and of Rohan, and of course the epic tales of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But none of that is present in the Second Age, which I actually think is a good thing. The First Age is the age of the elves, the Eldar days, where men do feature, but it is the Eldar who stand out at the forefront of most of the action. And of course the Third Age is kind of the opposite. It is the age of men, where elves do feature, but they seldom take the reins of the story. However, I would characterize the Second Age as the age of the Alliance, the only age where both elves and men are presented as equally important in the shaping of Middle-earth. And the Second Age is just so awesome. And as I say, it could perhaps be described as the most diverse and varied age. We of course get massively epic elven characters like Celebrimbor and Gil-galad and Elrond and Galadriel, but we also get a load of massively epic men from Númenor such as Isildur and Elendil and Ar-Pharazôn, and we get dwarves in their prime too. During the Second Age, Khazad-dûm is at the height of its splendour and power, and that's something that I would absolutely love to see done well. But I guess the elephant in the room in regards to the Second Age, the thing that makes it utterly different from both the First Age and the Third Age, is that Tolkien never really wrote all that much about it. Obviously the First Age is very comprehensively documented in the Silmarillion, and the histories of the Third Age make up most of the Lord of the Rings appendices, but the Second Age, not so much. There are, of course, about 70 pages in the Silmarillion that detail a very specific part of the Second Age, but other than that, there's not much beyond the middle part of the Unfinished Tales, and a small part of the Lord of the Rings appendices. But these don't really tell a Second Age story, they're just a collection of writings that happen to be set in the Second Age. And I guess this is a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, is it worrying that they chose to adapt the part of Tolkien's writings with the least adaptable material? Maybe, yes. But on the other hand, I suppose this does mean that they hopefully can't get things too wrong. I don't know, maybe I'm just being an optimistic fool, but there is so much potential to show us new and exciting parts of Middle-earth that Tolkien hardly mentioned. And there's a lot of scope to expand on what he did mention. If there is one word that I would use to describe the Second Age, it is potential. So I really hope we see that potential realised. There are so many unknowns to explore and so many things to embellish. Ents, for example. We know they existed in the first age and we know they existed in the third age, so it stands to reason that they must also be kicking around in the second age. And I think it will be very, very cool to see them on screen without having to worry too much about the specific details of what Tolkien wrote, because there are no details on second age Ents. Same with dragons. So, for now, a second age setting is something that I'm cautiously hopeful about. Number 9. The budget. Alright, so this is definitely also a double-edged sword, and part of me does worry that $1 billion show can't possibly make its money back whilst also faithfully and respectfully adapting Tolkien's works, but I'm supposed to be keeping it positive for now, so let's focus on the good. Because, although as far as I'm aware the exact budget figures haven't been released, most sources agree that by the time the first series airs, Amazon will have spent over $1 billion on the production. $1 billion? And so I'm hoping that this means, regardless of storytelling ability or good writing, which aren't really anything to do with budget, we will at least see some amazing visuals and amazing props and costumes and attentions to detail that will be made all the more fantastic, hopefully, by these seemingly limitless resources. I cannot wait to see Gil-galad's Noldarine kingdom of Lindon and Khazad-dûm in its prime, and I think if this were a regular TV show with a limited budget, I would worry that maybe the majesty of Tolkien's world would be simply unachievable to replicate. But hopefully, this will not be the case. If it is, that is pretty unforgivable. And one of the things that I was most excited to learn is that at least a small part of this budget will be spent on Howard Shore and on bringing his music back to Middle-earth. It may be an unpopular opinion, but I'm actually incredibly glad that this isn't set in the same universe as Peter Jackson's movies. I think having Hugo Weaving and Cate Blanchett reprise their roles as Elrond and Galadriel would be a bit of a terrible decision. But if there is one part of Jackson's movies that I do think belongs in prime second age show, it is Howard Shore's music. I think my absolute favourite moment in Peter Jackson's films that depart significantly from the books is the lighting of the beacons scene. This isn't what Tolkien wrote, but it is an amazing moment on film. And although New Zealand's natural beauty and Jackson's sweeping camera work are a big part of that, realistically, the entire sequence is carried by Howard Shore's music. So if all we get is a few shots of nature underscored by the music of Howard Shore, I will at least be a little bit happy. Number 8. New characters. Okay, so this may also be a controversial opinion, and I know there's quite a few fans who think that Amazon should just stick with the characters that Tolkien wrote without needing to invent more, but I respectfully disagree on this. Yes, it's true that Tolkien wrote and named a ton of characters, 888 in fact, but not so many in the Second Age. And if Amazon's Second Age were only populated with the characters that Tolkien actually gave us, I think it would feel very sparse indeed. Middle-earth needs inhabitants, and as I've said, there is no Second Age equivalent of the Silmarillion. Inventing new characters is simply inevitable. Although, I will say, there is of course a precedent for new characters being added to Tolkien's works and not working in the slightest. I'm of course talking about Tauriel and Alfred from the Hobbit movies, and I will say that Alfred is probably my absolute least favourite thing in all of Peter Jackson's movies. He is absolute trash. I hate him. But my problem with Alfred, and also to an extent with Tauriel, isn't that they exist, it's that they're terribly written. In fact, if Tauriel didn't have a ridiculous and quite frankly anti-feminist love triangle that defines 90% of her actions in the movie, I think I'd probably quite like her. And so, if these new Rings of Power characters, such as Bronwyn and Halbrand and Arondir, are well written, and they do feel like they belong in the world and in the story, then I think they could be a very enjoyable part of the show. Obviously, I can't talk about the actors' acting ability, I've not seen anything yet, but I am at least a little bit appeased by the fact that their names do seem to belong in this world. Halbrand is a Sindarin name. It probably means something along the lines of tall and noble. Similarly, Bronwyn may mean steadfast, if it's a Sindarin cognate of the word Voronwë, and Arondir could also perhaps be translated to something like lordly male, or king male. So at least the names do seem to fit the world, although these are, as I say, Sindarin names, which means it only makes sense if the characters they belong to are either descended from Sindarin-speaking men, aka the Edain, or they're elves who migrated from the ruins of Beleriand. If Bronwyn or Halbrand turn out to be middlemen with no connection to the Edain, then this will completely fall apart. But keeping it positive, hopefully both Bronwyn and Halbrand and everyone else with a Sindarin name will justify their names. I mean, if this series doesn't pay attention to language, then they've basically just spat upon the entire foundations of Tolkien's entire works. But no, stop complaining, this is a hopeful video. Number 7. What does Amazon have the rights to? When the series was first announced, this was the first question that I asked, and it has remained one of the things that I've been most concerned about. Like, how can anyone tell the story of Númenor if you don't have the Silmarillion rights to the Akallabeth, or to Ar-Pharazôn, or to Morgoth? However, as we've learned more about this show, this is actually an issue that I've become quite excited by. So this promotional picture of Númenor, one of the first things we got, proves that the production must have the rights to more than just the Lord of the Rings and its appendices. The places that are labelled on this map are only ever discussed in the unfinished tales. Even the Silmarillion doesn't give us these kinds of details. Similarly, in the Vanity Fair article, they make mention of Galadriel's dead brother. Now, as it goes, she has 4 dead brothers at the time of the Second Age, but none of them are mentioned outside of the Silmarillion, or Tolkien's other even lesser known writings like Morgoth's Ring and the Peoples of Middle-earth. And yet they clearly, at least to an extent, have the rights to use this stuff, which massively expands the scope of what this series can portray, and it could mean we're in for something really amazing. If Rings of Power has the rights to the unfinished tales and the peoples of Middle-earth, then they could give us stories like Eldarion and Erendis, the Númenorian mariner who explored much of Middle-earth and had a very estranged relationship with his wife. Or what about Legolas's grandfather Oropher and his founding of the Woodland Realm? Or even Glorfindel and the Blue Wizards? These are details that I never thought could make it into a live-action adaptation, but perhaps that's not the case. I've not seen any official release on exactly what Amazon can and cannot use, but from what we've seen so far, I think we can be relatively confident that they'll be pulling information from fairly obscure places. Although, again, this is of course a double-edged sword, because the more they have the rights to, the more actual lore from Tolkien they have to stick to. For example, in the War of the Jewels, we are explicitly told that no man nor elf has ever seen a beardless dwarf. For the Naugrim have beards from the beginning of their lives, male and female alike. Nor indeed can their womenkind be discerned by those of other race, be it in feature or in gait or in voice. And yet here we have a very feminine-looking, almost beardless dwarf. I'm not being negative, I'm just pointing out a discrepancy that I will tear to shreds in my next video. Anyway, number 6. Locations. Now, I know that the word diverse has become somewhat politically loaded as of late, but there is no other word to describe the myriad of places that Tolkien wrote about in Middle-earth. And the Second Age is where we see some of the absolute most diverse and varied locations, from the woodland kingdoms in the east, to the Grey Havens in its prime, to Khazad-dûm in its prime, to Númenor in its prime, and this is something that I'm really excited to see. I think there is an argument to be made that the show could have just stuck to one set of locations and just told one self-contained story before moving on to the next one, but if they're not going to do that, then I think there is an excellent opportunity to explore all of these incredibly different and incredibly cool parts of the world, some of which we've only seen a bit of and some we've never seen before. I'm really hoping that we'll get to see familiar locations like Lothlorien and Khazad-dûm and maybe Mordor, but we'll see them through a different lens and at a very different time in their histories to what we see in The Lord of the Rings. And I am especially hopeful about these new locations. It's been confirmed that we will see Galadriel sailing upon the Sundering Sea in the first few episodes, and we're also told that those new Bronwyn and Arendor characters will be living in the Southlands of Middle-earth in a new location called Tir Harad, which probably means something along the lines of watch or guard over the south, Harad. Tir, of course, can be found in the word Palantir, where it means to watch from afar, and Minas Tirith is, of course, a Sindarin name meaning Tower of the Guard. So I'm hoping it will be very cool to see a location in the south, where we know we will meet Sindarin-speaking men and elves. It's a part of Middle-earth that's never been explored before, so best case scenario, we get a really interesting and unique exploration that broadens the dimensions of Tolkien's world, and worst case scenario, even if it's bad, it's not going to directly contradict what Tolkien wrote. Hopefully. Number 5. The First Age. So if you've seen any other videos on this channel, you'll probably know that I am a huge fan of the First Age, the Elder Days of Feanor and the Silmarils and Beren and Luthien and Morgoth. And what's very cool is that although this show will almost certainly take place predominantly after the end of the First Age, it seems that the First Age will still be a relevant part of the backstory. One of the first promotional pictures we got was this, which very explicitly shows the 2 trees of Valinor in the background. And these 2 trees were actually destroyed before the First Age properly began, at least if the First Age is defined as beginning with the rising of the sun. So even if it is just a flashback or a prologue, it does seem pretty assured that the First Age will at least feature in the Rings of Power. According to that Vanity Fair article, the first episode of the show will be called A Shadow of the Past, which is of course a reference to the second chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring, but whereas that Shadow of the Past is a reference to Sauron and his actions in the Second Age, this Shadow of the Past must be a reference to Morgoth and to all the darkness and trauma of the First Age. We are told by people close to the production that the story will begin after an era of horror and conflict. The wicked god Morgoth has been defeated and his apprentice Sauron has vanished. As the series begins, Galadriel is hunting down the last remnants of their collaborators who claimed the life of her brother. And this is good. This shows us that the Second Age does not exist in a vacuum. It is effectively a bridge between the madness of the Elder Days and the relatively more subdued histories of the Third Age. And I think beginning the story in the aftermath of this world-breaking conflict and focusing on the repercussions of a devastating war during a time of apparent peace is something that I'm hoping this show will do very well. If it's effectively executed, I think it could be a highlight. Oh, and just in case you're new to this channel and you want to learn more about the First Age, I have a whole series of playlists detailing that history and working through the epic stories of the Silmarillion, so check them out to learn more about the backstory that the Rings of Power will hopefully be working with. Number 4. All those familiar faces. So I've talked about new characters in the show, but it is also 100% confirmed that the Rings of Power will focus on some of the very familiar faces from the Lord of the Rings that were kicking around back in the Second Age. And it seems that the 2 characters at the forefront here are Galadriel and Elrond, which I will tentatively say is great news. Both Galadriel and Elrond are personal favourite characters of mine, and I reckon a good number of you guys will agree. And I think seeing younger versions of these characters and exploring what it was they did in the Second Age that allows them to grow into such household names of the Third Age could be very, very exciting. Although it does of course come with skin-prickling implications, because if they mess up a character like Bronwyn, for example, I don't really care. But if they do my Lady Galadriel dirty or Elrond dirty, I will take that as a personal offence. There is a lot of pressure to get these incredibly beloved characters right, but I'll talk about that in my fears video. But one thing I will say for the sake of fairness is that 2 of my all-time favourite Second Age characters in the books are Elrond and Isildur, and if I'm being 100% honest, I think both Elrond and Isildur were portrayed particularly badly in Peter Jackson's movies. Most of what Peter Jackson did was good, but not Elrond and not Isildur. I go into much more detail on this in my series comparing Jackson's Lord of the Rings to Tolkien's, but I think there is a real opportunity here for the Rings of Power to rehabilitate some of those unfairly portrayed characters. I'd like to see a younger looking Elrond, I'd like to see a softer, kinder Elrond, and I would like to see a nobler and more honourable Isildur. Perhaps Rings of Power could even correct some of the movie's missteps. Although, again, slight reservations about the whole young Galadriel thing. Even if this show takes place right at the beginning of the Second Age, Galadriel should not be young. And by the time Isildur does his ring-cutting thing at the end of the age, she is 5,353 years old. Anyway, keeping it positive, there are other familiar faces beside Galadriel and Elrond and Isildur that we could very well end up seeing. Like, what about Celeborn? Galadriel's clearly a major character in the show, so where's her husband? He really should be in it. Same with Elendil. You can't do a show about Isildur without showing his father. But perhaps the familiar face that I'm most excited to see fleshed out is, of course, the main villain, Sauron. I've talked about this quite a lot in previous videos, and on Friday I have another video coming all about Sauron in the First Age, but Sauron really is my favourite villain in all of Tolkien's writings. I think he's such a fantastic character, but by the time of The Lord of the Rings, all of his best days are behind him. All the things that make him so great as a character simply aren't present by the end of the Third Age. But the Second Age, that is the age of Sauron. That is the period where he is at the top of his game and he is taking Middle-earth by the horns. Number 3. So even more than the familiar characters, it is the less familiar characters that I really cannot wait to see fleshed out in the Rings of Power. And the big 3 here, in my mind, are Celebrimbor, Gil-galad, and my joint number 1 favourite elf in the entire Legendarium, Círdan the Shipwright. Even now, I am honestly struggling to repress my absolute love for Círdan. If I were weaker-willed, I'd give up on this video and just spend the next hour gushing about how awesome Círdan is, but I'll hold myself back. Círdan is a character that must surely feature in the Rings of Power. He is the Lord of the Grey Havens. He is the guy who raised High King Gil-galad as a child. He is the bearer of Narya, the Ring of Fire. He was friendly to the Númenóreans. He built the ships for the elves to sail west on. He distrusted Sauron. He fought in the War of the Last Alliance, and he urged Isildur to destroy the One Ring when he had a chance. Círdan is the MVP of all of Middle-earth's history, but the Second Age is a wonderful opportunity to showcase one of the most underrated but overly amazing elves that Tolkien ever put to pen. And Gil-galad and Celebrimbor are awesome too. I really hope we get to see the last High King of the Noldor in all his glory, and potentially use him as another opportunity to explore his epic First Age ancestors. Although, just one more minor apprehension, how can Celebrimbor coexist in a story with Isildur? Celebrimbor dies 1,512 years before Isildur is even born. Anyway, it's not time to dwell on the negatives. Moving on, number 2. The showrunners seem to understand and appreciate Tolkien's major themes. Maybe. ? So this is another one of those things that was actually a massive worry of mine until quite recently, but to an extent I have been a little bit assuaged by some of the new information we've learned. And you may think I've completely lost my mind. One of the biggest controversies surrounding the show was the fear that it would be either overly political or a desecration of the world that Tolkien spent his life building, but I think there is at least some room to be cautiously hopeful here. In that Vanity Fair article, we're told that whoever wrote the article has seen the first 3 episodes, and among the words that they used to describe what they saw are palace intrigue, magic, warfare, and mythology. And mythology is the key word here that makes me happy, because although I know that Tolkien's writings are often described as fantasy, and pretty much the entire genre of modern fantasy is built upon Tolkien's foundations, I don't actually think fantasy is the right word to describe what Tolkien created. It is mythology. That's how he saw it, and hopefully that's how the showrunners see it. And there's another glimmer of hope that I found out only quite recently, because according to a lady called Jennifer Salk, who is the head of Amazon Studios, Jeff Bezos is personally a huge fan of Tolkien and incredibly passionate about all of it and very well versed. Now, obviously, I have no idea if any of that is true. I know nothing about Jeff Bezos' personal interests, except that he seems to share quite a few of them with Smaug. But if it is true that he is a huge fan and he was incredibly passionate about Tolkien's writings before he took the opportunity to make a massive profit out of them, and it is true that he's very well versed, then this is welcome news. I think the Lord of the Rings movies were good because they were made by people who first and foremost wanted to make them. Money was obviously a part of it, it's part of everything, but with the movies, I think there was creative integrity, and so, fingers crossed, the big man behind the Rings of Power will also share that integrity. Either that, or I'm just buying into the lies of a multi-million-dollar marketing company. But Jeff Bezos is of course not the guy who's actually writing and creating the show. The showrunners are Patrick McKay and J.D. Payne, and they're the ones who are really going to dictate whether or not the show is a faithful adaptation or a cautionary tale. And according to, well, their own words, so take this with a whole load of salt, we were passionate about the material and had a take that matched Amazon's appetites and ambition. The goal is to make a show for everyone, for kids who are 11, 12, and 13, even though sometimes they might have to pull the blanket up over their eyes if it's a little too scary. We talked about the tone in Tolkien's books. This is material that is sometimes scary, but it's also heartwarming and life-affirming and optimistic. It's about friendship, and it's about brotherhood and underdogs overcoming great darkness. And generally, I agree with that. They did also mention it being sometimes quite political, which may or may not be a red flag, but assuming these guys aren't just chatting nonsense for the sake of promoting their own TV show, which is a possibility, I don't think they're way off the mark with wanting to create something that is optimistic and life-affirming. I'm certainly glad that no one's going for a gritty, hyper-violent, or hypersexual Middle-earth. It worked for Game of Thrones, and I did really enjoy the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones. The brutality and the realism are a significant part of the books, and they were put in there as a subversion of the genre that Tolkien founded. A Song of Ice and Fire adaptation needs to be R-rated, and a Middle-earth adaptation needs not to be. And it isn't going to be, so happy days. Number 1. So, this is the big thing. This is the one thing that no amount of bad writing, or dodgy politics, or studio manipulation, or questionable direction can ever take away. Because, honestly, it doesn't really matter how awful the Rings of Power may, or hopefully may not be. The truth is, it simply isn't a big enough deal to have any impact on how wonderful Tolkien's writings are. And at the end of the day, they are the bottom line. If the show is terrible, nothing's gonna change. But if it's good, it could usher in a whole new wave of appreciation for the creator of Middle-earth. I truly do believe that this TV show will serve as a gateway for people who may not know anything about Tolkien's works, but will become inspired to learn more based on what they see. And that is only a good thing. I was 6 years old when the Fellowship of the Ring movie was released, and at that age I was obviously way too young to appreciate anything that Tolkien had written, but the movies opened my mind to the world that he created. If they hadn't captured my imagination, I don't know how long it would have been before I discovered this thing that I now definitely would say enriches my life. Jackson's movies aren't perfect, but I owe them a debt of gratitude for bringing Tolkien to my attention. And it makes me very happy to think that in, 30, 40, 50 years, there will probably be a new generation of writers and artists and creators who take inspiration from Middle-earth, and perhaps some of them will tell stories about how they watched the Rings of Power as children and how that opened their minds to one of the greatest fictional worlds ever created. A large, vibrant, dedicated, and passionate Tolkien community will keep these writings in the forefront of our collective culture for generations to come. And regardless of all potential sins that the Rings of Power may or may not commit, I do truly believe it will be good for Tolkien fans in the long run. So, that's it. They are my positive thoughts on the Rings of Power. And I guess it's possible that I'm just being a bit of a cheerfully optimistic wanker. Maybe this show will be absolute trash. Maybe it won't. I just don't know. But if you want to hear my less savoury opinions, I will upload another video in the next few days where I'll talk all about my top 10 fears and concerns, of which I certainly do have many. So keep your eyes open for that if you're interested, and at the end of this week I will upload the next instalment of my Beren and Luthien Untangled playlist, where I will talk about Sauron and his werewolves of the First Age. So, to make sure you don't miss anything in the future, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer mellyn.